I signed my name in the registry on a November morning, so cold that my breath clouded the ink before it could dry. What I did not know, as I handed the pen to my new husband, was that the dead had already signed before me. They told me it would be a marriage of convenience, and I believed them because I needed to. My uncle's house had become a place where I could no longer draw breath without permission, where every meal was a reminder of my dependence, every morning a calculation of how long his charity might last. When Julian Blackwood's solicitor arrived with the proposal, I did not ask why a baronet of good family and considerable estate would want a bride with nothing but a respectable name and a talent for watercolors. I did not ask, because I could not afford to care. The wedding took place in a small stone chapel on the edge of Julian's property in Hampshire, far from London, and farther still from anything resembling society. There were no guests. The vicar was an old man with trembling hands who read the service as if he had long ago stopped believing in the words. Julian stood beside me in a black morning coat that made his shoulders look broader than they were, his face composed in that particular way men have when they are performing a duty rather than celebrating a joy. He was handsome in the stark manner of a winter landscape, all sharp lines and cool distances, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of smoke on water. When he took my hand to place the ring, his fingers were as cold as mine. I had met him only twice before that morning. Once at my uncle's house, where he had spoken to me for precisely 12 minutes in the drawing room, while my aunt pretended not to listen from behind her embroidery hoop. Once at his solicitor's office in London, where we signed the settlements and he told me, in a voice utterly devoid of feeling, that Blackwood Hall was isolated but comfortable, that I would have my own rooms, and that he did not expect me to love him. I remember thinking, as I signed my name to the marriage contract, that his honesty was almost cruel. But cruelty I could endure. It was hope that had always destroyed me. After the service, we walked through the cold vestibule to the tiny sacristy where the registry waited on a wooden table worn smooth by decades of names. The room smelled of damp stone and old prayer books, and the single window let in a light so gray it seemed to leach the color from everything it touched. The vicar opened the registry with hands that shook slightly, turning pages filled with the faded ink of marriages long past. He pointed to the place where I was to sign, and I did, my hand steadier than I expected. Eleanor Ashford, I wrote, for the last time. Then I moved aside, and Julian took the pen. He signed quickly, his handwriting neat and controlled. Julian Marcus Blackwood. The vicar nodded, murmured something about witnesses, and gestured to the line below. That was when I saw it. The space for the witness signature was already filled. I blinked, certain I had misread, but the ink was there, dark and fresh, as if it had been written only moments before. Alexander Blackwood, it said, in a hand that was similar to Julian's but looser, more confident, the letters slanting forward as if the writer had been in a hurry, or simply unafraid. I stared at the name, my heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Alexander Blackwood, Julian's older brother. The brother who had died 3 years ago in a fall from his horse on the grounds of Blackwood Hall, his neck broken, his body found at dawn by a groundskeeper. I knew this because my aunt had told me, her voice hushed with the particular relish society reserves for tragedy among the titled. She had also told me that Julian had inherited everything, that there had been whispers about the circumstances, and that Julian had withdrawn from society entirely after the funeral, refusing even to attend Parliament. I looked up at Julian. He was staring at the registry, his face drained of what little color it had held. The vicar was fussing with the pen, oblivious, humming tunelessly under his breath. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask, to demand some explanation, but Julian's hand closed over my wrist with a grip that was just short of painful. "Not here," his eyes said. "Not now." So I said nothing. I watched as the vicar blotted the page, closed the book, and smiled at us with the vacant benevolence of a man who had married too many indifferent couples to expect enthusiasm. He wished us well. He shook Julian's hand. He did not seem to notice that the witness line had been signed by a man 3 years dead. Outside, the carriage was waiting, a black lacquered thing with the Blackwood crest on the door, pulled by two gray horses that stamped and snorted in the cold. Julian handed me in without a word, and I settled onto the velvet seat, my wedding dress heavy and uncomfortable, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. He climbed in after me, and the door closed with a sound like a vault ceiling. We did not speak as the carriage rolled away from the chapel, down a narrow lane overhung with bare trees that clawed at the gray sky. I wanted to ask him about the signature. I wanted to demand an explanation, to insist that he tell me what sort of household I had just married into, what sort of madness or deception or grief had led to a dead man's name appearing in our wedding registry. But when I looked at his face, I saw something there that stopped the words in my throat. He looked afraid. Not startled, not confused, but deeply, coldly afraid, in a way that made my own fear feel small and childish by comparison. So instead, I turned to the window and watched the countryside pass, the fields brown and dead under a sky that promised snow. I thought about my uncle's house, about the small room where I had slept for 2 years, about the silence at meals and the way my aunt's eyes followed me as if she were calculating the cost of my presence down to the last shilling. I thought about the alternative to this marriage, which was no alternative at all, and I told myself that whatever waited for me at Blackwood Hall, it could not be worse than what I had left behind. I was, of course, wrong. Blackwood Hall appeared through the trees like something out of a Gothic novel, all dark stone and mullioned windows and towers that seemed to serve no purpose but to make the house look more forbidding. It stood on a rise overlooking a small lake, surrounded by ancient oaks that had grown so close to the walls they seemed to be trying to reclaim the building for the forest. The drive was long and lined with overgrown rhododendrons that scraped against the sides of the carriage as we passed. When we finally stopped before the main entrance, I looked up at the house and felt a coldness settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the November air. The door opened before we reached it, and a woman appeared in the shadows of the entrance hall. She was perhaps 50, dressed in black bombazine with a chatelaine at her waist, her hair pulled back so tightly from her face that it gave her the look of a woman in perpetual pain. She did not smile. She did not curtsy. She simply looked at me with eyes that were flat and assessing, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. "Mrs. Greer," Julian said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is Lady Blackwood." The housekeeper's gaze did not soften. She inclined her head a bare inch. "My lady, your rooms are prepared. I will show you up." Julian touched my arm, a brief cold pressure. "I must see to some business. Mrs. Greer will make you comfortable. We will dine at 8. And then he was gone, disappearing through a door to the left of the entrance hall, leaving me alone with the housekeeper and the terrible silence of the house pressing in on all sides. Mrs. Greer turned without waiting for my response and began to climb the staircase, her keys clinking softly at her waist. I followed, because there was nothing else to do, my hand trailing along the banister, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. The entrance hall was paneled in dark wood that seemed to swallow what little light came through the windows, and the air smelled of beeswax and something else, something faintly sweet and rotting that I could not identify. "Your rooms are in the west wing," Mrs. Greer said as we reached the first landing. "His lordship's chambers are in the east. You will find everything you require. If you need anything, you may ring for one of the maids, though we keep a small staff here. His lordship prefers privacy." I wanted to ask her what she meant by privacy. I wanted to ask her if she had seen the registry, if she knew about the signature, if she had known Alexander Blackwood, and what she thought of his name appearing in ink that should not have existed. But her back was rigid, her pace swift, and I understood that Mrs. Greer was not a woman who welcomed questions. She led me down a long corridor lined with portraits, faces staring down from the walls with the cold disapproval of the long dead. At the end of the hall, she opened a door and stepped aside. "Your sitting room, my lady. The bedroom is through there. I will have your trunks brought up within the hour." I walked past her into a room that was larger than any I had ever occupied, furnished in shades of blue and cream that should have been soothing, but felt instead like a chill. There was a fire burning in the grate, but it did little to warm the space. The windows looked out over the lake, where the water lay flat and gray as a sheet of lead. I turned back to thank Mrs. Greer, but she was already closing the door, her expression unchanged. I stood in the center of the room and listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. Then I walked to the window and pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep into my palm. This was my home now. This silent house, this disapproving staff, this husband who looked at me as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a wife to be cherished. I should have felt grateful. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt as if I had stepped into a trap that had been set long before I arrived. That night, I dressed for dinner in a gown of deep green silk that had been part of my modest trousseau, my hands shaking slightly as I fastened the buttons. A maid had come to help me earlier, a young girl with frightened eyes who barely spoke and who jumped at every sound. When I asked her name, she whispered Mary and fled the moment I dismissed her, as if she could not bear to be in my presence a moment longer than necessary. I wondered what they had told the servants about me. I wondered what they knew that I did not. The dining room was on the ground floor, accessed through a series of corridors that all looked the same in the dim light of the gas lamps. I found it by following the faint sound of silver against china. And when I entered, Julian was already seated at the head of a table long enough to seat 20. He rose when he saw me, his manners impeccable even if his warmth was not, and gestured to the chair at his right. I sat, and a footman I had not seen in the shadows stepped forward to serve the soup. We ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. The food was well prepared, but I tasted none of it. I was too aware of Julian's presence, of the way he ate with mechanical precision, his eyes on his plate, his expression unreadable. Finally, when I could bear it no longer, I set down my spoon and spoke. "The signature in the registry," I said quietly. "Your brother's name. How is that possible?" Julian's hand stilled. He did not look up. "I do not know. You must have some idea. Someone wrote it. Someone was in that sacristy before us." He raised his eyes to mine then, and I saw in them something that made my breath catch. Pain, yes, but also a kind of weary resignation, as if he had been waiting for this question and dreading it in equal measure. "My brother has been dead for 3 years, he said, his voice low and tightly controlled. "I have no explanation for what you saw. I have no explanation for many things that have happened in this house since his death. If I did, I would offer it to you. But I do not. And I would ask that you not speak of it to the servants. Why not? Because they are already frightened enough." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Frightened of what, I wanted to ask, but I could see from his face that he would not answer, or perhaps that he could not. We finished the meal in silence, and when the dessert had been cleared, Julian excused himself and disappeared once more into the depths of the house. I returned to my rooms, where the fire had burned low and the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. I undressed myself, too uncomfortable to ring for Mary, and climbed into the enormous bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. It was an old house, and old houses make noise. I knew that. The creak of timbers, the whisper of wind through cracks in the windows, the distant groan of pipes. All normal, all explainable. But then I heard it. Footsteps in the corridor outside my room. Slow, measured footsteps, as if someone were pacing back and forth. I held my breath, listening. They came closer, paused outside my door, and then moved away, fading into the distance. I thought of calling out, of asking who was there, but my voice would not come. After a long moment, I rose from the bed and crossed to the door, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard nothing. Slowly, I turned the handle and opened the door a crack, peering out into the corridor. It was empty. The gas lamps burned low along the walls, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. There was no one there. No footman, no maid, no Mrs. Greer making her rounds. I was about to close the door when I saw it. On the floor, just outside my threshold, there was a single white rose, its petals perfect and unblemished, lying on the dark wood as if someone had placed it there deliberately. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Then I bent down, picked it up, and carried it back into my room, closing the door behind me. I set the rose on the table beside my bed and climbed back under the covers, pulling them tight around me. The rose had no scent, and when I looked at it in the morning light that finally came, I would see that its stem had no thorns, as if someone had carefully removed every one. But that night, I lay in the darkness and wondered who had left it there, and whether they had been alive when they did. The rose was gone when I woke. I sat up in bed, the morning light pale and thin through the windows, and stared at the table where I had placed it the night before. The surface was empty. No petals, no stem, no evidence that anything had been there at all. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it, if the strangeness of the day and the exhaustion of the journey had conjured phantoms in my mind. But when I pressed my fingers to the wood, I felt the faint dampness where the stem had rested, and I knew it had been real. Someone had come into my room while I slept and taken it. The thought should have terrified me. It should have sent me running to Julian's chambers to demand an explanation, to insist that the servants be questioned, that the locks be checked. But instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if some part of me had expected this, as if I had married into a house where the rules I had always known no longer applied. I rose and dressed myself in a simple day gown of gray wool, practical and plain, the sort of dress that announced I had no illusions about my new position. I was not a bride who expected romance. I was a woman who had made a bargain, and I would honor it. When Mary knocked softly and entered with a breakfast tray, I thanked her and asked her to tell me about the house. She set the tray on the table by the window, her hands trembling slightly, and glanced toward the door as if she expected someone to be listening. "It is a very old house, my lady," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "built in the time of Queen Elizabeth. His lordship's family has lived here for generations. And the servants?" I asked gently. "How many are there?" "Not many, my lady. Mrs. Greer, myself, 2 other maids, a cook, and 3 men for the grounds and the stables. His lordship does not entertain." I poured tea from the silver pot, watching her face. She was perhaps 16, with fair hair tucked under her cap and eyes that darted everywhere but at me. "Did you know his lordship's brother?" I asked. "Alexander." The effect of the name was immediate. Mary's face went white, and she took a step back, her hands clasping together in front of her apron. "I should go, my lady. Mrs. Greer will be wanting me." She fled before I could stop her, the door closing with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. I sat alone with my breakfast and looked out at the grounds, at the lake below and the forest beyond, dark and tangled and forbidding. This house held secrets. That much was clear, and if Julian would not tell me what they were, I would have to discover them myself. After I ate, I decided to explore. No one had forbidden me to, and I reasoned that if I was to live here, I ought to know the shape and scope of my new prison. I left my rooms and walked down the corridor, past the portraits that watched with their dead eyes, and descended the main staircase. The house was silent in the way that large houses are during the day, a kind of held breath, as if it were waiting for something to happen. I found the library first, a long room lined with books from floor to ceiling, the volumes leather-bound and ancient, smelling of dust and forgotten knowledge. There was a desk by the window, papers scattered across its surface, and I walked over to see what Julian might be working on. Estate accounts, mostly, and letters from his solicitor in London. Nothing personal, nothing that revealed anything about the man I had married. I moved on, opening doors at random. A music room with a pianoforte covered in a sheet. A drawing room with furniture draped in holland covers. A conservatory filled with plants that had grown wild and tangled, as if no one had tended them in years. Every room felt abandoned, as if the house had stopped living long before I arrived. And then I found the portrait. It hung in a small gallery off the main hall, a room I had not noticed the day before. The walls were covered in paintings of Blackwood ancestors, stern-faced men and women in the fashions of centuries past. But it was the largest portrait, the one that dominated the far wall, that stopped me in my tracks. 2 men stood side by side, dressed in hunting clothes, a landscape of rolling hills behind them. They were clearly brothers, their features similar enough to mark them as family, but different enough to make them distinct. The man on the left was Julian, younger than he was now, perhaps 25, his face less careworn, his eyes brighter. The man on the right was taller, broader in the shoulders, with the same dark hair, but a face that was more open, more alive. He was smiling, not at the painter but at something beyond the frame, as if he had just heard a joke and could barely contain his amusement. "Alexander," I whispered to the empty room. I stepped closer, studying his face. He was handsome in a way that Julian was not, his features less refined but more compelling, the kind of face that drew the eye and held it. There was something magnetic about him even in paint, a sense of vitality and confidence that seemed at odds with the somber house around me. I wondered what he had been like in life. I wondered if Julian had loved him or resented him. I wondered how a man so full of life had ended up dead at 30. "You should not be in here." I spun around. Julian stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He was dressed for riding, in boots and a dark coat, and there was mud on his gloves as if he had just come in from the grounds. He looked at me, and then at the portrait, and something flickered across his face that I could not read. "I am sorry," I said, though I was not certain what I was apologizing for. "I was only exploring the house. I did not mean to intrude." "This room is kept locked," he said, his voice tight. "How did you get in?" I looked back at the door. It was open now, but I had not forced it. I had simply turned the handle, and it had given way. "The door was unlocked," I said. "I did not know it was forbidden." He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood beside me, staring up at the portrait. For a long moment he said nothing, and I wondered if he was seeing his brother or seeing himself, the version of himself that had existed before whatever had happened to change him. "That was painted 10 years ago," he said finally. We had just returned from Scotland. Alexander had shot a stag, and he insisted we commemorate the occasion. He always insisted on commemorating things. He believed life should be celebrated at every opportunity. There was something in his voice that made my throat tighten. Not anger, not bitterness, but a kind of grief so deep it had worn grooves into his soul. "What was he like?" I asked softly. Julian turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something unguarded in his eyes. "He was everything I am not," he said. "Charming, reckless, beloved by everyone who knew him. He could walk into a room and make it brighter simply by being there. People gravitated to him the way flowers turn toward the sun." "And you?" I said. "What did you feel?" He looked away. "I loved him, and I envied him. And when he died, I did not know whether to grieve or to feel relieved that I would no longer have to live in his shadow. The honesty of it startled me. I had expected deflection, perhaps anger at my prying. But instead, Julian had given me a truth so raw it felt like a wound. I wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to offer some comfort. But I did not know how, and I was not certain he would accept it if I did. "How did he die?" I asked. Julian's jaw tightened. He fell from his horse. His neck was broken. The inquest ruled it an accident, but you do not believe it was. He looked at me then, and I saw the fear again. The same fear I had glimpsed in the carriage the day before. "I do not know what I believe," he said. "I only know that since his death, this house has not been the same. And I would ask that you not wander the corridors alone, especially at night. There are rooms in the East Wing that are locked for a reason." "What reason?" He did not answer. He simply walked past me, out of the gallery, leaving me alone with the portrait and the weight of all the things he had not said. That afternoon, I took tea in my sitting room and tried to read a novel I had brought from London, but the words blurred on the page. I kept thinking about Alexander's face in the portrait, about the way Julian had spoken of him with love and resentment tangled so tightly together they could not be separated. I thought about the signature in the registry and the rose that had appeared and disappeared. I thought about the East Wing and what Julian might be hiding there. When the light began to fade, I rang for Mary and asked her to bring more coal for the fire. She came quickly, her eyes downcast, and busied herself with the grate. I watched her for a moment, then decided to try again. "Mary," I said gently, "I know you are frightened. I do not wish to cause you distress, but I need to understand this house. Can you tell me what happened to Alexander Blackwood?" She froze, the coal scuttle in her hands. Then slowly, she set it down and turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "He died, my lady, 3 years ago. That is all anyone knows. But there is more, is there not? People are afraid. Even Mrs. Greer seems uneasy. Mary glanced at the door, then back at me. She lowered her voice. "They say he did not want to go, my lady. They say his spirit is still here, in the house, that he walks the corridors at night looking for something, or someone." "Who says this?" "All of us, my lady. The servants. We have all heard him. Footsteps in the empty rooms, doors opening and closing. And sometimes in the east wing there is music. The piano playing, even though no one is there." My heart began to beat faster. "Have you seen him?" She shook her head quickly. "No, my lady, I have not. But Mrs. Greer has. She saw him once, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down into the hall. She says he looked as real as you or I, but when she called out to him, he vanished. I felt cold all over. Does his lordship know about this?" Mary's expression turned pitying. "His lordship knows, my lady. He does not speak of it, but he knows. Why do you think he stays in the east wing? Why do you think he keeps those rooms locked?" She picked up the scuttle and fled before I could ask anything more, leaving me alone with the fire and the growing darkness outside the windows. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, and tried to make sense of what I had learned. If Alexander's spirit truly haunted this house, if Julian knew and had said nothing, what did that mean for me? Was I meant to live here, surrounded by the restless dead, pretending that nothing was amiss? Was I meant to ignore the footsteps and the music and the roses that appeared from nowhere? Or was I meant to help somehow? Was that why the rose had been left for me? Was Alexander trying to tell me something? The thought was absurd. I did not believe in ghosts. I had been raised in a rational household, taught that the dead were gone and that what people called hauntings were nothing more than tricks of the mind or the wind. But I could not deny what I had seen. I could not deny the signature in the registry or the rose or the footsteps outside my door. And I could not deny that some part of me, some irrational, foolish part, wanted to know more. That night, I dressed for dinner and went down to the dining room, where Julian was waiting. We ate in silence again, though this time the silence felt different, heavier, as if the things we were not saying had taken on physical weight. When the meal was over, I rose to leave, but Julian spoke before I could go. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used my given name. I stopped, turning back to him. He was still seated, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his face shadowed in the candlelight. "Yes," I said. He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I know this is not the marriage you hoped for. I know I am not the husband you deserve. But I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. If you see or hear anything unusual, you are to come to me at once. Do you understand?" I nodded slowly. "I understand. But Julian, if there is something in this house, something dangerous, should I not know what it is?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I thought he might tell me. I thought he might finally trust me with the truth, but instead, he rose from his chair and walked to the door, pausing only to say over his shoulder, "There is nothing in this house but grief and memory, and both are best left alone." Then he was gone, and I was left standing in the empty dining room, surrounded by the ghosts of conversations we would never have. I returned to my rooms and prepared for bed, my thoughts churning. I did not believe him. There was something in this house, something more than grief and memory, and whether Julian wanted me to investigate or not, I could not simply ignore it. I was already part of this mystery, whether I liked it or not. The moment I had seen Alexander's signature, I had been drawn into something larger than a marriage of convenience. I climbed into bed and blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. I lay there, listening to the silence, waiting. And just as I was beginning to drift towards sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps in the corridor. Slow and deliberate, coming closer. This time, I did not hesitate. I rose from the bed, pulled on my dressing gown, and went to the door. I opened it quickly, before I could lose my nerve, and stepped out into the corridor. The gas lamps were burning low, casting long shadows along the walls. At the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, I saw a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. He stood with his back to me, utterly still, as if he were waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, to demand that he turn around, but my voice would not come. So I simply stood there, watching, as the figure began to move. He walked slowly toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and as he reached the landing, he turned his head slightly, just enough that I caught a glimpse of his profile. It was Alexander. I knew it with a certainty that bypassed reason. The shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, all matched the portrait I had seen that morning. He paused at the top of the stairs, one hand resting on the banister, and for a moment I thought he might turn fully, might look at me and acknowledge my presence. But he did not. He descended the stairs, slowly and deliberately, and disappeared into the darkness below. I stood frozen in the corridor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Then, without thinking, I followed. I moved as quietly as I could, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, my hand trailing along the wall for balance. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down, but I could see nothing in the darkness below. I hesitated, fear warring with curiosity, and then I heard it. Music, faint and distant, coming from somewhere on the ground floor. The sound of a piano, playing a melody I did not recognize. It was beautiful and melancholy, the notes falling like rain, and it pulled at something deep inside me, something I had thought long buried. I descended the stairs, following the music, my dressing gown trailing behind me. The entrance hall was dark, the gas lamps extinguished for the night, but a faint light glowed from beneath the door to the music room. I crossed the hall and pushed open the door, my hands trembling. The room was empty. The piano sat in the corner, its lid open, but there was no one seated at the keys, and yet the music continued, filling the air with its haunting melody, as if invisible hands were playing. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, and walked toward the instrument. The music stopped. I stood in the sudden silence, staring at the keys. They were still, untouched, but I could feel the presence in the room, as real and solid as my own. I could feel someone watching me, waiting. "Alexander," I whispered. "Is that you?" For a moment, nothing. And then, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard a voice. Not spoken aloud, but inside my mind, as clear as if someone had whispered directly into my ear. "Help me." I did not sleep that night. I returned to my room and sat by the window, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to gray, my mind replaying those two words over and over. Help me. I did not know if I had truly heard them, or if my imagination had supplied what I expected to hear. I did not know if Alexander's spirit was truly haunting this house, or if I was simply succumbing to the same fears and superstitions that gripped the servants. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could not ignore what was happening. Not anymore. When Mary brought my breakfast, I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since the night before. "Where is Alexander Blackwood buried?" She nearly dropped the tray. Her hand shook as she set it on the table, and when she looked at me, her eyes were wide with something close to panic. "In the family plot, my lady, behind the chapel where you were wed. But no one goes there, not even his lordship." "Why not?" She lowered her voice to barely a whisper. "Because Mr. Alexander did not want to be buried there, my lady. He told people, before he died, that he wanted to be cremated and his ashes scattered in Scotland, where he had been happiest, but his lordship would not allow it. He insisted on a proper burial in the family vault. Some say that is why Mr. Alexander cannot rest." I felt a chill run down my spine. Did Alexander know he was going to die? Mary's face went very pale. "I do not know, my lady. But in the weeks before the accident, he was different, troubled. He argued with his lordship about something. The whole house could hear them shouting, though none of us knew what it was about. And then, one morning, he rode out early and never came back alive. She fled before I could ask more, leaving me with my tea and a growing sense of dread. If Alexander had been troubled before his death, if he and Julian had quarreled, then perhaps the fall from his horse had not been an accident at all. Perhaps it had been something else, something Julian was hiding. I needed to see the grave. I needed to understand what had happened and why Alexander's spirit was still bound to this house. And if Julian would not tell me, I would have to find the answers myself. I dressed in my warmest walking dress and a heavy cloak and ventured downstairs. The house was quiet, the servants going about their duties in silence, and I slipped out through a side door without encountering anyone. The morning was cold and damp, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. I walked across the grounds, past the overgrown gardens and the dark lake, following a narrow path that led toward the chapel. The building looked different in daylight, smaller and more forlorn, its stone walls stained with moss and age. Behind it, I found a low iron gate half hidden by brambles, and beyond that, a small cemetery enclosed by a crumbling stone wall. I pushed open the gate, which groaned on rusted hinges, and stepped inside. The graves were old, most of them dating back centuries, the inscriptions on the headstones worn smooth by time and weather. But at the far end of the plot, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient yew tree, I found what I was looking for, a marble tomb, newer than the others, with a single name carved into its surface: Alexander Marcus Blackwood, born 1858, died 1888, beloved son and brother. I stood before it, my hands clasped in front of me, and felt an overwhelming sadness wash over me. He had been only 30 years old, he had been loved, and now he was trapped here, in a place he had not wanted to be, unable to move on. "I am here," I whispered to the cold stone. "I do not know if you can hear me or if this is madness, but if you need help, I will try to give it. Tell me what you want. Tell me what happened to you." The wind stirred the branches of the yew tree, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A sigh, perhaps, or a word half-formed. But when I strained to listen, there was only silence. I was about to turn away when I noticed something strange. The ground in front of the tomb was disturbed, as if someone had been digging there recently. I knelt down, heedless of the damp earth staining my dress, and brushed away the loose soil. My fingers touched something hard and smooth, and I pulled it free. It was a locket, silver, tarnished with age, with a delicate chain still attached. I opened it with trembling hands and found inside a miniature portrait of a woman. She was young and beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at me, and there was something familiar about her face, though I could not place it. On the opposite side of the locket, engraved in tiny script, were the words, "Forever yours, C." I closed the locket and slipped it into my pocket, my heart racing. Who was C, and why had this been buried at Alexander's grave? I needed to find out. I needed to understand what this meant. I returned to the house and went directly to the library, hoping to find some record, some clue that might explain the locket. Julian was there, seated at his desk, writing letters. He looked up when I entered, and I saw a flicker of surprise cross his face. "Eleanor," he said, rising to his feet, "I did not expect to see you. Is something wrong?" I hesitated, uncertain how much to tell him. "I went to the chapel," I said carefully, "to see your brother's grave." His expression darkened. "Why?" "Because I wanted to understand, because I need to know what happened to him." Julian's jaw tightened. "I have told you, Eleanor. It was an accident. There is nothing more to understand." I took a breath, steadying myself. "Then why is his spirit still here? Why does he walk these corridors at night? Why does he play the piano in an empty room? Why, Julian, does a dead man ask for help?" The silence that followed was deafening. Julian stared at me, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as if he needed it to keep himself upright. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He spoke to you." I nodded. "Last night, in the music room," he said. "Help me." Julian closed his eyes, and I saw something break inside him. He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping, and when he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a grief so raw it made my chest ache. "I did not want you to know," he said quietly. "I married you to give you a home, to give you safety. I did not want you to be drawn into this nightmare. But it seems I have failed, as I fail at everything." I crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite him, my heart pounding. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me what happened. Let me help." He looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he could trust me. Then slowly, he began to speak. "Alexander and I were never close," he said. "Not in the way brothers should be. He was the favored son, the charming one, the one everyone loved, I was the spare, the serious one, the one who managed the estate and paid the bills while he danced and hunted and lived as if there were no consequences. I resented him for it. God help me, I resented him bitterly. But you loved him too, I said softly. Julian nodded. Yes. Despite everything, I loved him. And 3 years ago, he told me he was going to marry. He had fallen in love with a woman, someone entirely unsuitable. The daughter of a tenant farmer, a girl with no name, no fortune, nothing to recommend her but her beauty. My father had just died, and I was now the head of the family. I forbade the marriage. I told Alexander it would ruin us, that society would never accept it, that he was being selfish and reckless as always. And what did he say? He said he did not care. He said he loved her, and that love was more important than propriety or reputation or any of the things I valued. We argued. We said terrible things to each other. And the next morning, he rode out before dawn, furious and reckless, and his horse threw him. His neck was broken instantly. Julian's voice cracked, and he pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting for control. I blamed myself, he continued after a moment. I still do. If I had not been so rigid, so determined to preserve the family name, he would still be alive. And now his spirit haunts this house, and I do not know if he is here because he cannot forgive me or because there is something else, something I am missing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket, setting it on the desk between us. I found this, I said quietly, at his grave. Do you know who C is? Julian picked up the locket and opened it, staring at the portrait inside. His face went even paler. Catherine, he whispered. Her name was Catherine, the girl he wanted to marry. Yes, I sent her away after his death. I gave her money, told her to start a new life somewhere else. I thought it was for the best. I thought it would help her forget. But it did not help him forget, I said. Did it? Julian shook his head, his fingers closing around the locket. No, it did not. I leaned forward, my voice urgent. Julian, if Alexander's spirit is still here, if he cannot rest, perhaps it is because he needs to know she is all right. Perhaps he needs to know that she is safe, that she has forgiven him for leaving her. Or perhaps there is something more, something about his death that was not an accident. Julian's eyes snapped to mine. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that we need to find out the truth. If you truly want to help your brother, if you truly want him to rest, we must investigate. We must speak to the people who were here that morning. We must find Catherine. We must uncover what really happened. He stared at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or fear, or some complicated mixture of both. You would do this, he asked. You would help me, even though it may lead to terrible truths. I would, I said, because I believe Alexander deserves peace, and because I believe you deserve it too. For the first time since I had met him, Julian smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, more human. Thank you, Eleanor, he said quietly. I do not deserve your kindness, but I am grateful for it nonetheless. We spent the rest of the morning in the library, going through estate records and correspondence, looking for anything that might shed light on Alexander's death. Julian told me that the inquest had been brief, the verdict swift. The groundskeeper who had found the body testified that Alexander's horse had returned to the stables alone, wild-eyed and foaming. They had followed the trail back and found Alexander lying in a field near the edge of the property, his neck broken, his body cold. But there had been no witnesses. No one had seen the fall. And the horse, a gentle mare that Alexander had ridden for years, had never thrown him before. It does not make sense, I said, poring over the inquest report. If the horse was gentle, why would it suddenly bolt? And if Alexander was an experienced rider, how could he not have controlled it? Julian shook his head. I asked myself the same questions. But the coroner ruled it an accident, and there was no evidence to suggest otherwise. I had no grounds to demand further investigation. What about the argument you had the night before? I asked. Did you tell the coroner about that? He looked away. No, I did not see the relevance. And I did not want to give anyone reason to suspect that I had anything to do with his death. But you were nowhere near the field when it happened, I said. Were you? Julian's silence was answer enough. I felt my stomach drop. You were there, I whispered. You saw what happened. He stood abruptly, walking to the window, his back to me. I followed him, he said, his voice hollow. After our argument, I could not sleep. I was angry, and I wanted to make him see reason. So when I heard him leave at dawn, I saddled my own horse and went after him. I caught up to him near the edge of the property. We argued again. He told me I was a coward, that I cared more about what society thought than about him. And then he rode off, faster than was safe, his horse galloping toward the trees. What did you do? I followed. I was shouting at him to stop, to come back, but he would not listen. And then I saw something. A figure standing in the trees. It startled Alexander's horse, and she reared. He tried to hold on, but he was thrown. I heard the crack of his neck, and I knew, even before I reached him, that he was gone. I felt cold all over. Who was the figure? Julian turned to face me, his eyes hollow. I do not know. By the time I reached Alexander, there was no one there. I searched the area, but I found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I told myself I had imagined it, that it had been a trick of the light or a shadow, but I have never been certain. Did you tell anyone about this? He shook his head. No. I was afraid of what they would think. Afraid that they would suspect me of having pushed him or frightened the horse deliberately. So I said nothing. I let them believe it was an accident, and I have lived with the guilt ever since. I reached out and took his hand, and he flinched as if he had not expected the touch. Julian, I said gently, if there was someone else there, if someone deliberately startled the horse, then Alexander's death was not your fault. It was murder. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate hope that was painful to see. Do you truly believe that? I do, I said, and I believe that is why Alexander's spirit cannot rest. He knows the truth, and he wants us to find it. He wants justice. Julian's hand tightened around mine, and for the first time I felt a connection between us that was more than duty or convenience. We were bound now by secrets and by the ghost that haunted us both. Then we must find Catherine, he said quietly. She may know something. She may have the answers we need. That afternoon, Julian sent inquiries to the village and to his solicitor in London, trying to trace Catherine's whereabouts. While we waited for replies, I continued to explore the house, searching for any other clues that might help us. I went to the east wing, to the rooms Julian had said were locked, and found that the door was indeed bolted from the outside. But when I pressed my ear to the wood, I could hear something, a faint sound, like breathing or the rustle of fabric. I knocked softly. Alexander, I whispered, are you there? There was no answer, but the sound stopped. And then, slowly, I heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the door. They stopped just on the other side, so close I could almost feel the presence through the wood. I want to help you, I said, but I need you to tell me what happened. I need you to show me. For a long moment, there was silence, and then the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I stood there, my hand pressed to the door, and felt a sadness so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. He was there. He was trapped, and I did not know how to free him. That night at dinner, Julian was quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When the meal was over, he asked me to join him in the library, and I followed, sensing that something had changed. He handed me a letter that had arrived that afternoon. It is from my solicitor, he said. He has found Catherine. She is living in York, working as a seamstress. I have written to her, asking if she will see us. If she agrees, we will leave in 2 days. I read the letter, my heart racing. This was it. This was the key to understanding what had happened to Alexander. And perhaps, if we were fortunate, the key to setting him free. I looked up at Julian. Thank you, I said, for trusting me with this, for letting me help. He smiled, that same fragile smile that made him look so much younger. It is I who should thank you, Eleanor. You have given me something I thought I had lost. Hope. We stood there in the firelight, and for a moment I thought he might reach for me, might close the distance between us, and offer something more than gratitude. But he did not. He simply nodded, wished me good night, and left me alone with the fire and my thoughts. I returned to my room and prepared for bed. my mind full of questions and possibilities. But as I was about to blow out the candle, I heard it again. The footsteps in the corridor. I rose and went to the door, opening it quickly. Alexander stood at the end of the hallway, as he had before. But this time, he turned to face me. I could see him clearly now, his features sharp in the dim light, his eyes dark and intense. He looked at me, and I saw in his gaze something that made my breath catch. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of desperate longing. And then he lifted his hand and pointed toward the stairs, toward the ground floor, as if urging me to follow. I did not hesitate. I wrapped my dressing gown around me and followed him down the stairs, through the entrance hall, and out into the cold night. He led me across the grounds, toward the edge of the property, where the forest began. And there, in a clearing bathed in moonlight, he stopped. He turned to face me one last time, and I saw his lips form a single word, Catherine. Then he vanished, and I was alone in the darkness, the wind whispering through the trees. We left for York on a morning wrapped in mist, the carriage rattling through the gates of Blackwood Hall as the house receded into the fog behind us like a memory half forgotten. Julian sat across from me, his face turned toward the window, his hands resting on his knees. We had barely spoken since the night Alexander had led me to the clearing, since I had returned to the house cold and shaken and found Julian waiting in the entrance hall, his face pale with worry. I had told him what I had seen, and he had listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. Then he had simply said, "We leave at first light," and walked me back to my rooms. Now, as the miles stretched between us and Hampshire, I felt the weight of what we were about to do settle over me. We were going to meet the woman Alexander had loved, the woman Julian had sent away. We were going to ask her questions that might shatter whatever peace she had managed to build in the 3 years since his death. And we were going to do it because a ghost had asked for help, and because neither of us could bear to live with the questions any longer. The journey took most of the day. We stopped at an inn for lunch, a quiet meal during which Julian barely touched his food, and then continued north as the landscape changed from gentle hills to harsher, more industrial vistas. By the time we reached York, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple, and the streets were slick with rain. Julian had arranged for us to stay at a respectable hotel near the Minster, and we checked in as Lord and Lady Blackwood, our marriage serving as both shield and disguise. That evening, Julian sent a note to the address his solicitor had provided, informing Catherine that we would call on her the following morning. Then we dined in awkward silence in the hotel dining room, surrounded by other travelers who laughed and talked as if the world were not full of ghosts and secrets. When the meal was over, Julian walked me to my room and paused at the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming with me. I could not do this alone." I looked at him, at the exhaustion in his eyes and the tension in his shoulders, and felt something shift inside me. He was not the cold, distant man I had married. He was simply someone who had been carrying too much grief for too long, and who had finally found someone willing to help him bear it. "You do not have to thank me," I said. "We are in this together now." He reached out and took my hand, his touch gentle. "Eleanor," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my heart quicken. "Whatever we discover tomorrow, whatever Catherine tells us, I want you to know that I am grateful, not just for your help, but for your presence. For the first time since Alexander died, I do not feel entirely alone." I squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in my throat. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and I thought he might say something more, might cross the invisible line that had kept us apart since our wedding day. But instead, he released my hand, wished me good night, and retreated down the corridor, leaving me standing at my door with my heart beating too fast and my thoughts in disarray. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with fragments of Alexander's face and the sound of a woman weeping. When morning came, I dressed carefully in a somber gown of dark blue, pinned my hair into a simple arrangement, and met Julian in the lobby. He looked as tired as I felt, his eyes shadowed, his expression tense. We did not speak as we hired a cab and gave the driver the address. Catherine lived in a narrow street on the edge of the city, in a boarding house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling from the door and the windows were grimy with soot. Julian hesitated before knocking, his hand raised, and I saw the doubt flicker across his face. Then he set his jaw and rapped twice, the sound echoing in the quiet street. The woman who answered was not what I expected. I had imagined someone fragile, broken by grief, perhaps still beautiful, but faded like a pressed flower. Instead, Catherine was striking in her plainness, with strong features and clear gray eyes that assessed us with a directness that was almost disconcerting. She was dressed in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back severely, and there was a stillness about her that spoke of hard-won composure. "Lord Blackwood," she said, her voice flat, "I received your note. I did not think I would ever see you again." Julian inclined his head. "Miss Harper, may we come in?" She stepped aside without a word, and we followed her up a narrow staircase to a small room on the second floor. It was clean but sparse, furnished with only a bed, a chair, a small table, and a sewing basket overflowing with fabric. The single window looked out onto a brick wall. She gestured for us to sit, though there was only one chair, and Julian offered it to me while he remained standing. Catherine stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. "This is my wife," Julian said, "Lady Eleanor Blackwood." Catherine's gaze shifted to me, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or pity. "So you remarried," she said. "I am glad. A house like that should not stand empty." "It is not empty," I said quietly. "Your Alexander is still there." The effect of my words was immediate. Catherine's composure cracked, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "You have seen him," she whispered. "Yes," I said. "I have seen him, and he has asked for help. That is why we are here. We need to understand what happened to him. We need to know the truth." She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. "I have tried to forget," she said, her voice breaking. "I have tried to build a new life, to put the past behind me. But I dream of him every night. I hear his voice calling to me, and I cannot escape the feeling that he is still waiting for something." Julian moved closer, his voice gentle. "Catherine, I know I wronged you. I know I sent you away when you needed support. I have regretted it every day since. But I am asking you now, as someone who loved Alexander as much as I did, to help us. Tell us what happened in the days before his death. Tell us anything that might explain why he cannot rest." Catherine wiped her eyes and took a shuddering breath. "We were going to elope," she said. "Alexander had arranged everything. We were to leave the night before he died, to go to Scotland and marry there. He said he did not care what his family thought, that he would rather lose his inheritance than lose me. But then, something happened. 2 days before we were to leave, he came to me in a state I had never seen before. He was terrified." "Terrified of what?" I asked. She shook her head. "He would not tell me. He said only that someone had discovered our plans and that we were in danger. He said I must not meet him as we had arranged, that I must stay away from Blackwood Hall until he sent word that it was safe. I begged him to explain, but he refused. He kissed me, told me he loved me, and left. That was the last time I saw him alive." Julian's face had gone very pale. "Did he say who had discovered your plans?" "No, but he was afraid of this person. I could see it in his eyes. He said that if anything happened to him, I must leave Yorkshire and never return. He made me promise, and I kept that promise, until now." I leaned forward, my mind racing. "Catherine, do you know of anyone who would have wanted to harm Alexander? Anyone who might have had a reason to stop the elopement?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "There was someone," she said slowly. "A woman, Lady Cordelia Ashworth. She was the daughter of your father's closest friend, Lord Blackwood. There had been an understanding, an expectation that Alexander would marry her. It was never formalized, but everyone assumed it would happen. When Alexander told his father he intended to marry me instead, Lady Cordelia was furious." Julian went very still. "Cordelia," he said, his voice barely audible. I had forgotten about her. Catherine nodded. "She came to see me 3 days before Alexander died. She found me in the village, and she told me that I was a fool if I thought Alexander would defy his family for someone like me. She said that men of his class did not marry tenant farmers' daughters, that he would tire of me and cast me aside. And then she said something strange. She said that if I truly loved him, I would let him go before he destroyed himself. Before he destroyed himself, I repeated. What did she mean by that? I do not know, Catherine said, but her eyes when she said it, they were cold, so cold. I told Alexander about the encounter, and that was when he became frightened. He said Cordelia was more dangerous than I realized, that I must be careful. And then, 2 days later, he was dead. I looked at Julian, and I saw the realization dawn in his eyes. The figure you saw in the trees, I said. The one that startled Alexander's horse. Could it have been a woman? He closed his eyes, thinking. It could have been, he said. The figure was too far away for me to see clearly, and I assumed it was a man because of the height. But Cordelia is tall for a woman. It is possible. Then we need to speak with her, I said. We need to know if she was there that morning, and if she had any part in Alexander's death. Julian shook his head slowly. Cordelia married 6 months after Alexander died. She is now Lady Cordelia Weston, and she lives in Bath. But Eleanor, even if she was there, even if she did startle the horse, we have no proof. It would be her word against mine, and I did not see enough to accuse her of murder. Then we must find proof, I said. We must make her confess. Catherine rose from the bed, her expression determined. I will come with you, she said. If Cordelia is responsible for Alexander's death, if she took him from me, then I want to face her. I want her to know that I have not forgotten and that I will not rest until she pays for what she has done. Julian looked at her, and I saw the conflict in his face. It may be dangerous, he said. If Cordelia is capable of murder, she will not confess easily. I do not care, Catherine said. I have lived with this grief for 3 years. I have nothing left to lose. We left York the next morning, the 3 of us traveling together in a compartment on the train to Bath. Catherine sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. Julian sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, and I was acutely aware of the tension radiating from his body. We were going into unknown territory now, confronting a woman who might be a murderer, and none of us knew what we would find. As the miles passed, Catherine began to talk. She told us about her life with Alexander, about the secret meetings in the woods and the letters they had exchanged, about the dreams they had shared of a life together far from society's judgment. She spoke of him with a love so deep and pure it made my chest ache, and I found myself envying her. She had known what it was to be truly loved, even if only for a brief time. She had known what it was to be chosen, to be someone's entire world. I glanced at Julian and found him watching me, his expression unreadable. Our eyes met, and something passed between us, something unspoken but profound. And I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I wanted what Catherine had had. I wanted to be loved like that. And I wanted, more than I had allowed myself to admit, for Julian to be the one to love me. We arrived in Bath in the late afternoon and took rooms at a hotel near the Royal Crescent. Julian made inquiries and learned that Lady Cordelia Weston was in residence at her townhouse on Pulteney Street. He sent a card requesting an audience the following day, and we waited to see if she would receive us. That evening, as Catherine retired to her room, Julian asked me to walk with him. We strolled through the streets of Bath as the lamps were lit, the city glowing golden in the fading light. Neither of us spoke for a long time, and then Julian said quietly, "I am sorry." I looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For bringing you into this," he said. "For burdening you with my family's darkness. You deserved better than a husband haunted by ghosts and secrets." I stopped walking and turned to face him. "Julian," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "I chose this. I chose to help you, and I do not regret it." He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other. This is not the marriage you agreed to." "Because I believe in justice," I said. "Because I believe Alexander deserves peace. And because," I hesitated, then pressed on, "because I have come to care for you more than I thought possible." The words hung between us, and for a moment I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I had revealed too much too soon. But then Julian reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and sure. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not deserve you. I do not deserve your kindness or your courage or your faith in me, but I find myself grateful for it nonetheless, and I find myself—" He paused, searching for words, wanting more than I have allowed myself to want in a very long time. "What do you want?" I whispered. He stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup my cheek. "I want to be the husband you deserve," he said. "I want to give you more than convenience and safety. I want to give you—" He hesitated, then said softly, "Love." My heart felt as if it might burst from my chest, and before I could think, before I could doubt, I rose on my toes and kissed him. It was not a perfect kiss. It was tentative and uncertain, the kiss of two people who were still learning each other, but it was real and it was ours. And when we pulled apart, Julian rested his forehead against mine and let out a shaky breath. "Eleanor," he whispered, "I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." We walked back to the hotel in silence, our hands clasped together, and I felt as if something fundamental had shifted. We were no longer two strangers bound by a marriage of convenience. We were two people who had chosen each other, who had walked through darkness together and found something unexpected on the other side. The next morning, we received a reply from Lady Cordelia. She would see us at 2:00 that afternoon. The three of us dressed carefully, as if preparing for battle, and took a cab to her townhouse. It was an elegant building, all white stone and black railings, with flower boxes in the windows and a gleaming brass door knocker. A butler answered and showed us into a drawing room furnished in pale blues and creams, everything tasteful and expensive. Lady Cordelia entered a few minutes later. She was beautiful in the way that wealthy women often are, with carefully arranged blonde hair and a complexion maintained by expensive creams and careful avoidance of the sun. She wore a gown of lavender silk that whispered as she moved, and her smile was polite but did not reach her eyes. "Lord Blackwood," she said, extending her hand. "What a surprise to receive your card. And this must be your new bride. How charming." Julian made the introductions, including Catherine, whose presence made Cordelia's smile falter for just a moment. "Please sit," Cordelia said, gesturing to the sofa. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Julian did not sit. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, his posture rigid. "We have come to ask you about my brother," he said, "about the morning he died." Cordelia's expression did not change, but I saw her fingers tighten on the arm of her chair. "Your brother's death was a tragedy," she said smoothly, "but I do not see what it has to do with me. I was not even at Blackwood Hall at the time." "Were you not?" I said, my voice quiet. "Then can you explain why Julian saw a figure in the trees that morning, near the place where Alexander fell? A figure that startled his horse." Cordelia's gaze snapped to me, and for a moment I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. "I have no idea what you are referring to," she said. "Perhaps Lord Blackwood was mistaken. Grief can play tricks on the mind." Catherine stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "You came to see me 3 days before Alexander died," she said, her voice shaking. "You told me to let him go. You said if I truly loved him, I would not let him destroy himself." "What did you mean by that, Lady Cordelia? What were you planning?" Cordelia rose as well, her composure slipping. "I meant that he was making a fool of himself," she said sharply, "throwing away his future for a tenant farmer's daughter. I was trying to protect him from his own stupidity." "By killing him," Julian said, his voice like ice. Cordelia went very pale. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you come into my home and accuse me of murder?" "Then deny it," I said. "Tell us you were not there that morning. Tell us you did not follow Alexander into the woods. Tell us you did not deliberately startle his horse, knowing it would throw him." Cordelia stared at us, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and I saw the moment she realized she had lost. Her face crumpled, and she sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. "I did not mean to kill him," she said, her voice muffled. "I only wanted to frighten him, to make him see reason. I thought if I could scare him enough, he would give up this foolish plan to elope. I did not know the horse would rear like that. I did not know he would fall." "But you did nothing to help him," Julian said, his voice flat. "You let him die, and then you walked away." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I was frightened," she said. I panicked. I thought if anyone knew I had been there, they would blame me. So I ran, and I have lived with the guilt ever since. Guilt, Catherine said, her voice breaking. You speak of guilt, but Alexander is dead because of you. He is dead, and I have spent 3 years mourning him. And you married and moved on as if nothing had happened. Cordelia wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. What do you want from me? She asked. An apology. Absolution. I cannot bring him back. Nothing I say or do will change what happened. We want the truth, Julian said. And we want you to face justice. You will write a full confession, detailing everything that happened that morning. And then you will sign it, and we will take it to the authorities. She stared at him in horror. You would ruin me, she whispered. You would destroy my marriage, my reputation, everything. You destroyed my brother, Julian said coldly. You destroyed Catherine's future. And you condemned my family to live in a haunted house because Alexander's spirit cannot rest. Yes, Lady Cordelia, I would ruin you, and I would do so gladly. For a long moment she simply looked at him. Then slowly she rose and walked to the writing desk in the corner. She took out paper and pen, and she began to write. We watched in silence as her hand moved across the page, steady despite the tears that continued to fall. When she finished, she signed her name at the bottom and handed the paper to Julian. Here, she said, her voice hollow. Take it. Do what you will with it. I no longer care. Julian took the confession and folded it carefully, placing it in his coat pocket. Then he looked at her one last time. You should have cared 3 years ago, he said, before it was too late. We left her there, weeping in her elegant drawing room, and walked out into the bright Bath afternoon. None of us spoke as we returned to the hotel. The confession felt heavy in Julian's pocket, a weight that was both terrible and necessary. That night, as Catherine slept and Julian and I sat together in the hotel sitting room, he took my hand and said, It is over. We have the truth. We can finally let him rest. I nodded, but even as I did, I felt a coldness in my chest, because I knew, somehow, that it was not quite over. Not yet. Alexander had asked for help, and we had found the truth. But would it be enough to free him? Or was there something more he needed, something we had not yet understood? We would find out, I knew, when we returned to Blackwood Hall. We returned to Blackwood Hall on a twilight evening when the sky was the color of old bruises and the first stars were beginning to appear. The house looked different somehow, as if it had been waiting for us, as if it knew we were bringing answers. Catherine sat beside me in the carriage, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale but resolved. Julian sat across from us, the confession folded in his breast pocket, a weight we could all feel even though we could not see it. As the carriage rolled up the drive, I saw Mrs. Greer standing in the doorway, her face drawn. She said nothing as we climbed down, but her eyes moved from Julian to Catherine to me, and I saw understanding there and perhaps a glimmer of hope. We will need the household gathered, Julian said quietly. Everyone who serves here, in the entrance hall, in 1 hour. Mrs. Greer nodded and disappeared into the house. Catherine looked up at the darkening windows of Blackwood Hall and drew in a shaky breath. I have not been here since before he died, she whispered. I used to meet him in the gardens, in secret. I never thought I would return. You are welcome here now, Julian said, and his voice was gentle. You should have been welcome 3 years ago. I was wrong to send you away. She looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes, and nodded. Thank you, she said simply. We went inside, and the house felt different. The oppressive silence that had greeted me on my arrival was gone, replaced by something expectant, something almost alive. I could feel Alexander's presence everywhere now, stronger than before, as if he knew we had brought the truth home and was drawing closer to receive it. Julian led us to the library, where a fire had been lit against the evening chill. We sat together, the 3 of us, and waited. Catherine's eyes moved around the room, taking in the books and the desk and the window overlooking the lake. And I knew she was imagining Alexander here, alive and whole, working at his correspondence or reading by the fire. He spent hours in this room, Julian said, following her gaze. He loved books. He used to say that a well-stocked library was worth more than all the gold in England. Catherine smiled through her tears. He told me the same thing. He promised that when we were married, he would fill our home with books, and we would read to each other every evening. You would have made him happy, Julian said, and his voice cracked. Happier than I ever saw him. And I took that from both of you. I am so deeply sorry, Catherine, for everything. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. You did not take him from me, she said. Cordelia did, and you did not know what she would do. You cannot blame yourself for the cruelty of another. But I drove him to it, Julian said. If I had not been so rigid, if I had supported him instead of opposing him, perhaps he would not have felt the need to elope. Perhaps he would still be alive, or perhaps not, I said quietly, and they both looked at me. Perhaps Cordelia's obsession would have driven her to violence regardless. Perhaps this was always going to happen, because she could not bear to lose him to someone else. You cannot know, Julian. You can only choose what to do now. He looked at me, and I saw gratitude in his eyes. You are right, he said, and what we must do now is give Alexander the peace he deserves. An hour later, we gathered in the entrance hall. Mrs. Greer stood with the other servants, Mary beside her, their faces solemn. Julian stood at the foot of the stairs, Catherine and I flanking him, and he addressed them all. 3 years ago, my brother died in what was ruled an accident, he said, his voice carrying through the hall. But it was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate act by someone who wished to prevent him from marrying the woman he loved. We have obtained a confession, and the person responsible will face justice. But before we take that step, before we move forward, we must do something else. We must tell Alexander the truth. He has haunted this house because he could not rest, because he did not know what had happened to him. Tonight, we will give him that knowledge, and we will, God willing, set him free. The servants exchanged glances, fear and hope mingling on their faces. Mrs. Greer stepped forward. What do you need us to do, my lord? I need you to bear witness, Julian said. I need you to be here to see what happens. Because this is not just about my family. This house belongs to all of us, and Alexander's spirit has affected all of us. We will face this together. They nodded, and we waited. The fire in the great hearth crackled, and the clock in the hall ticked steadily, marking the seconds. And then, slowly, the temperature began to drop. I could see my breath misting in the air, could feel the cold seeping into my bones. The candles flickered, their flames bending sideways though there was no wind. He is here, Catherine whispered, and her voice was filled with longing and fear in equal measure. I felt him before I saw him, a presence on the stairs, heavy and expectant. And then he appeared, materializing out of the shadows, standing halfway up the staircase with one hand on the banister. He looked exactly as he had in the portrait, tall and vital and impossibly real, except that I could see through him to the wall behind. His eyes moved across the assembled group and stopped on Catherine. The sound she made was half sob, half gasp. Alexander, she breathed, and took a step toward him. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one of such profound love and sorrow that it made my chest ache. Then his gaze moved to Julian, and I saw something shift in his features. A question, perhaps, or an accusation. Julian stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Alexander, he said, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he felt. I know you have waited for answers. I know you have been trapped here, unable to rest, because you did not understand what happened to you. We have found the truth, and we have brought Catherine here so that you might see her one last time, so that you might know she never stopped loving you. Alexander's form flickered, like a candle flame in a draught, and I heard a sound that might have been a sigh or might have been the wind moving through the house. It was Cordelia, Julian continued. Lady Cordelia Ashworth. She followed you that morning. She was in the woods, and she startled your horse deliberately, trying to frighten you into giving up your plan to elope. She did not mean to kill you, but her actions caused your fall. And then she fled, leaving you to die alone. She has confessed to everything, and she will face the consequences. Alexander's gaze remained fixed on Julian, and I could not tell if he understood, if the words were reaching him across whatever gulf separated the living from the dead. But then Catherine moved forward, climbing the stairs until she stood just below him, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if he had been solid. "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "I loved you with everything I had, and I have mourned you every day since you left me. But Julian is right. It is time for you to rest, Alexander. It is time for you to let go. I will be all right. I will live my life, and I will remember you always, but I will not let grief destroy me. You would not have wanted that." Alexander looked down at her, and I saw his lips move. I could not hear what he said, but Catherine could. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I know, and I forgive you. For leaving me, for dying, for all of it. I forgive you, my love. Now please, find your peace." He reached out, his hand hovering just above her face, and for a moment I thought I saw his fingers solidify, thought I saw him touch her cheek. Then his form began to fade, growing translucent, the edges of him blurring. But before he disappeared entirely, he looked at Julian one last time, and he smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it was forgiveness, and it was release. Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and pressed his hand to his mouth. Alexander's form dissolved into mist, and the mist rose toward the ceiling and dispersed, and he was gone. The temperature in the hall began to rise. The candles steadied, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the house for 3 years lifted, as if a great door had been opened and fresh air had rushed in. Catherine sank down onto the stairs, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I climbed up to sit beside her, putting my arm around her, and she turned into me and wept as if her heart were breaking. But these were different tears, I realized. Not the tears of unending grief, but the tears of release, of a wound finally beginning to heal. Mrs. Greer and the other servants stood in shocked silence for a moment, and then, one by one, they began to move. Mary came forward with a shawl for Catherine. The footman stoked the fire. Mrs. Greer looked at Julian with something like respect in her eyes and said, quietly, "It is done then, my lord. He is at peace." Julian nodded, unable to speak, and I saw in his face the lifting of a burden he had carried for so long it had become part of him. That night, after Catherine had been settled in a guest room and the servants had retired, Julian and I walked together through the house. It felt different now, lighter, as if the walls themselves were breathing easier. We went to the music room, where Alexander had played his ghost piano, and Julian sat at the instrument and lifted the lid. "Will you play?" I asked. He shook his head. "I am not musical. Alexander was the one with the talent. I always envied him that too, among so many other things." I sat beside him on the bench, close enough that our shoulders touched. "You do not need to envy him anymore," I said. "You have your own gifts, Julian. Your sense of duty, your capacity for love, even when it is painful, your willingness to face the truth, no matter the cost." He turned to look at me, and in the candlelight, his face was transformed. "Eleanor," he said, "I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of this gift you have given me." "What gift?" I asked. "You," he said simply. "Your strength, your courage, your faith in me when I had none in myself. You have changed everything." He kissed me then, and it was different from the tentative kiss we had shared in Bath. This was deeper, more certain, the kiss of two people who had walked through fire together and come out stronger. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine. "I love you, Eleanor," he whispered. "I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment you demanded answers in the chapel. You were so fierce, so determined, and I knew then that you were not just a convenient bride. You were someone extraordinary." "I love you too," I said, and the words felt like a benediction. I did not think I would ever say them to anyone. I did not think anyone would want to hear them from me. But I love you, Julian, with all my complicated, inconvenient heart. He laughed, a sound I had never heard from him before, full and genuine. "Complicated and inconvenient," he repeated. "I would not have you any other way." We sat together in the music room for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the silence that was no longer oppressive but peaceful. And I thought about the strange path that had brought me here, from my uncle's cold house to a marriage of convenience to a love I had never expected to find. The next morning, Julian sent word to the authorities about Cordelia's confession. There would be an investigation, a scandal, perhaps a trial. But that was for the future. For now, we had done what we set out to do. We had found the truth, and we had set Alexander free. Catherine stayed with us for a week. She spent her days walking the grounds, visiting the places where she and Alexander had met in secret, saying her private goodbyes, and on the morning she left, she came to me in my sitting room and took my hands. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for helping him, for giving me the chance to say farewell." "You loved him well," I said. "That is all anyone can do." She smiled sadly. "I will always love him, but I will live too. I will not waste the years he did not have. And I will remember that love, even when it ends in sorrow, is still worth having." After she left, I went to find Julian. He was in the library, as I had known he would be, working on estate business. But when I entered, he set down his pen and stood, holding out his hand to me. "Walk with me," he said. We went out into the gardens, where the first signs of spring were beginning to appear. Green shoots pushing up through the dead leaves, buds forming on the bare branches. The lake sparkled in the sunlight, and the house behind us looked peaceful, no longer forbidding. "I have been thinking," Julian said as we walked, "about the future, about what kind of life we want to build here." "And what have you decided?" I asked. He stopped and turned to face me. "I want to open this house again. I want to fill it with light and laughter and life. I want to host gatherings, to reconnect with the world I withdrew from. But most of all," he reached out and cupped my face in his hands, "I want to fill it with love, our love, and perhaps, someday, with children who will never know what it is to live in a house of ghosts and secrets." I smiled up at him, my heart so full it felt as if it might overflow. "That sounds perfect," I said. He kissed me there in the garden, with the sun warm on our faces and the breeze carrying the scent of new growth. And I knew that we had been given something rare and precious, a second chance, a new beginning, a love that had been forged in darkness but would flourish in the light. The house never felt haunted again. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I thought I heard music drifting from the music room or footsteps in the corridor. But they were gentle sounds, comforting rather than frightening, and I chose to believe they were simply the echoes of memory, the house remembering the life it had once held. Julian kept his word. We opened Blackwood Hall to guests, hosting dinners and house parties, filling the rooms that had stood empty for so long. And gradually, the house came back to life, no longer a monument to grief, but a home filled with warmth and possibility. On the anniversary of Alexander's death, Julian and I walked together to the family plot. We stood before his tomb, and Julian placed a single white rose on the stone, its petals perfect, its stem stripped of thorns. "Thank you, brother," Julian said quietly, "for leading Eleanor to me, for showing me that love is worth any risk, any sacrifice. I hope you have found your peace. I hope you are with Catherine, in whatever way such things are possible. And I hope you know that you are not forgotten." I took Julian's hand, and we stood there in the quiet cemetery, saying our private farewells to a man we had both loved in different ways. And then we turned and walked back toward the house, toward our life together, toward the future we were building. 3 months later, I realized I was with child. Julian wept when I told him, not with sorrow, but with joy so profound he could barely speak. We decided that if it was a boy, we would name him Alexander, not as a burden, but as a tribute, a way of honoring the brother who had brought us together, who had refused to rest until the truth was known. And as the months passed and my body changed, as we prepared the nursery and chose linens and argued gently about names, I thought about the woman I had been when I arrived at Blackwood Hall, frightened, alone, convinced that I would never be truly loved. How wrong I had been, how beautifully, unexpectedly wrong. On a warm evening in late summer, I went into labor. Julian stayed by my side through all of it, holding my hand, whispering encouragements, refusing to be sent away even when Mrs. Greer insisted it was improper. And when our son was born, when I heard his first cry and felt his warm weight placed in my arms, I looked up at Julian and saw tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Julian whispered, touching our son's tiny hand with one finger. "He is absolutely perfect." We named him Alexander Julian Blackwood. And as I held him and looked out the window at the peaceful grounds of Blackwood Hall, I thought about all the ways that love can manifest. The passionate love between Alexander and Catherine, the complicated love between Julian and his brother, and the love that Julian and I had found, unexpected and hard-won, forged in the crucible of grief and mystery and trust. Our son grew strong and healthy, and Blackwood Hall rang with his laughter. And sometimes, when I rocked him to sleep in the nursery, I thought I felt a presence nearby. Not frightening, not cold, but warm and approving. And I whispered to the air, "Thank you, Alexander. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for bringing me here." Because in the end, that was what the haunting had been about. Not revenge or anger or unfinished business in the usual sense, but love. A love so strong it could not be contained by death. A love that reached across the gulf between worlds to ensure that those left behind would find their own happiness. Years later, when our son was old enough to understand, we told him the story of his namesake. We told him about the uncle who had died too young, about the love that had been thwarted, about the ghost who had haunted these halls until truth and justice had set him free. And we told him that he carried that legacy forward, that he was the living proof that love endures, that even in darkness there is light, and that family, in all its complicated beauty, is worth fighting for. He listened with wide eyes, and when we finished, he asked, "Do you think Uncle Alexander is proud of me?" Julian and I exchanged a glance, and I saw in his eyes the same certainty I felt. "Yes," I said, "I think he is very proud, and I think he is at peace." Our son smiled and ran off to play, and Julian pulled me close. We stood together in the drawing room where I had once sat alone and frightened, and I marveled at how much had changed, how a house of ghosts had become a house of love, how a marriage of convenience had become the greatest gift of my life. I signed my name in that registry on a cold November morning, certain I was entering a loveless arrangement, a bargain made out of desperation. I did not know that the dead man who signed before me would change everything, that his restless spirit would lead me to truth, and to a love deeper than any I had imagined possible. Blackwood Hall stands peaceful now, its windows bright with lamplight, its rooms filled with warmth. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when Julian and I sit together by the fire and watch our son sleep, I whisper a silent thank you to the ghost who brought us together. Alexander is at rest now. His spirit walks no more, but his love, his fierce, undying love, lives on in this house, in this family, in the life we have built from the ashes of his tragedy. And that, I have learned, is the most powerful kind of haunting there is, not the terror of restless spirits, but the enduring presence of love, refusing to be silenced, insisting on being heard, and ultimately bringing light to even the darkest places.